Ladies and gents, welcome back to another Engineers podcast. Today I'm joined by co-founder and CTO Niall Kelly, who's at a company called Pavlov. The spirit of Pavlov is really about getting value to your customers as fast as possible. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the product in a little bit more detail. We're also going to be talking about one of Niall's specialisms at a couple of his previous companies. And this actually falls into my territory as well. So the interview process, we're going to be breaking down the blank canvas, how to build a calibration session, but also interviewing and the landscape then. And we'll talk about the landscape now. Niall, thanks for coming to join us. How are you?
I'm good. Absolute pleasure to be here.
Good man. Give us a bit of an intro into you and your background.
Oh, wow. I've bounced around a lot. I'll try and keep it to at least involving just this continent. So a few years ago, joined Intercom, basically helping them set up their product office in London. It was the first time they'd built product outside of the headquarters in Dublin, so it was a bit of a tightrope walk for them. Helped them figure that out, build out the office there, expanded it quite a bit, quite successful. Then in 21, headed over to Shopify to own a new thing. A lot of my career is basically going somewhere to own something that's just being built. So owned international expansion for retail at Shopify in engineering, built that out, brought it to 8 to 12 countries. I should remember this off the top of my head, but I don't. And then expanded out and ended up, by the time I left last year, myself and my two other co-founders were responsible for payments and hardware and expansion for retail at Shopify.
Love that. Yeah, two incredible businesses, and really where the interviewing experience comes from, it comes from those two businesses. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the show. Intro Pavlov for us, because you touched on it, you and your two co-founders, so some more smart people from Shopify. Talk to us about what you're building.
Yeah, so there's four of us in total. Three of us, all of us came from Intercom. Three of us came from Shopify. So it gets a bit confusing at times. But basically, Tom, who had previously worked at Intercom, then gone to Meta, had realized while he was at Meta that it was incredibly difficult to figure out how to help people kind of cross a chasm when it came to seeing value within a product. And there's all those moments that we've had with a product where something, for some reason, you just kind of need to suffer through a little bit of pain to get to all of the value that's sitting on the other side. And so that's, turns out, was a very difficult thing to build even at Meta with all of the engineering resources they had there. So he came to us and said, "Hey, I think this is a good idea. I think there's a lot of potential here." And we were like, "Oh, yeah, that sounds great. Let's see if we can make a go of this." So really, we're about bringing who your customers are, what they're doing into one place, and then giving you the tools to figure out where do they need a nudge. So it might be you have a 5-step onboarding flow. You see a customer struggled through steps 1 and 2. And you're like, look, we just need to give them that little incentive. Like, it's not so much a shove or a push, it's carrot, not stick, to get them through the remaining pieces. And it could be product adoption, it could be you're launching a new feature and you want people to try it out. You're like, look, I'm pretty sure you're going to enjoy it, so much so that I'm willing to put the equivalent of money on the line to incentivize you to try it, but we're all going to end up better out the other side of it. And so bringing all that data into one place, giving you access to be able to figure out what journeys people are going through, and then figure out what's the moment that you want to put that carrot in place. Because obviously, if you incentivize everything, you've kind of incentivized nothing and cost yourself a phenomenal amount of money. So the right people at the right time matters a lot.
Love it. Okay. We spoke about something offline that I think is a really interesting topic of conversation today. And when I say today, I mean, let's just say over the last 12 months. What's a product problem? What's an engineering problem? And you just decipher that for us and explain what you think one is and what the other is, if you like.
Absolutely. I think this is something that the larger the company, the less likely you are to run into it, because so many of the building blocks are already in place and you're just filling in these small little gaps. Like at Shopify, for instance, there was thousands of engineers building a core platform that worried about inventory and stock levels and consistency across all of these things. And retail could piggyback off all of that. So we didn't need to worry about those technical issues. We could just focus on the top little bit. But when you're our size, when you're a new startup, it can be very easy to confuse the idea of we've built a piece of technology that can do a thing with we now have a product that people can use to do the thing. And a lot of it is generally it comes down to the amount of understanding you're expecting people to bring with them when they come to the product. Because obviously, if you're an engineer who's built it, like you've literally been in the code, you're going to understand every single piece of it. You're going to understand where all the sharp edges are. You're going to understand, oh no, don't do that. You're going to get bad things will happen if you do that. Do this other thing instead. Whereas when it comes to a product, it's like, okay, what are the flows you expect people to go through? Where do you expect them to see the value? And most importantly, why should they keep trying to do this? Like if they hit a block in the first 5 minutes of trying to do something, why should they push through that and get to the other side? And I think, like for us at least, it was a lot to do with the data that we were exposing to people and how we were exposing that data. And it's very easy to build on the engineering side a product that just floods people with information, because whether it's one entry or 1,000 entries, it's roughly equivalent. It's one API call that just dumps everything into a UI. But when you're actually expecting a non-technical customer to go through that, you need to focus on, well, what value are they seeing at every step? How do they see that there is light at the end of the tunnel and that they're not just on step 2 of a 300-step process to see value out of this?
Yeah, I like that, especially the product example, because I think it's really important. And a lot of businesses are talking about it at the moment. We're doing the difficult engineering under the hood stuff so that you have a really good customer experience. And it's about meshing the two, obviously, creating really good customer experiences, but separating what's the challenge, engineering or product. I think you've given us a couple of really good examples there.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I think people can get lost in and end up with what they think is a product, and it's incredibly well built and it's incredibly interesting, but it's like you still got. I think AI has made this an awful lot more complicated, because people think that just throwing a very well engineered, very carefully considered prompt over Claude or ChatGPT, and now you suddenly got a product, and it's like, whoa, no, take a step back there. Like, yes, it's an incredibly interesting piece of technology that can do lots of things, but where's the actual product in there? Where are people seeing the value? How are they working through it? How is it dealing with corner cases and edge cases? And are those clearly called out for people so that they can avoid them themselves?
I totally agree. That's probably another podcast in itself, I think. But we spoke about a lot of stuff we read on LinkedIn and AI and SaaS. We're just not there yet. In my opinion, we're just not there yet to really understand like the logic and like what customers want. We're just no way near the level of like.
It's kind of that sophistication. If you look back at 2007 when the iPhone came out, and I think it was within a year or two, the App Store was released. There was like one of the most popular apps was an app that turned your phone into a flashlight by just turning the screen white and going to max brightness. And that was a successful app. And it solved a problem at the time, but mostly because people had no idea what apps should be or could be. And so we're going for what the most obvious value was at the time. And then obviously Apple just decided, nah, that's just a button. here's a button, and made that go away. But I think we're seeing the same thing now, is that people are going after the ideas that are the stand out, they're the most obvious. And in 5 years' time, I don't think we'll even recognize what people will be up to with this, because I think there's a ton of potential there, but how you harvest it and how you do it well is something that I think we're only just starting to kind of figure out.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That's a really good example about the iPhone App Store. Really good example.
It shows my age.
Before we touch on interviewing, let's touch on next 12 months. Pavlov, as a growing, budding startup, that probably feels like a little bit of time away. But for what you can share with us, where would you like to be in 12 months?
12 months is a very long way away and a very, very short amount of time away. I think a lot of what we've seen early days with our design partners and first customers is that the core of the idea works very, very well. And now it's about how do we make it as accessible to as many people as possible. And so initially we kind of had an idea in our head that to be able to use us successfully, you'd need to have a really good idea of the data science within your company. You'd need to know about all of these events that you've created that indicated product usage and everything else. And as time has gone on, we've realized, oh, no, there's actually a ton of value without knowing even 10% of that. And so I think like the next 12 months is going to be ensuring that we haven't artificially created any boundaries for people coming on board, that we've got as open kind of a set of use cases as we possibly can, and that we've just made it accessible to people. Because one of the big things that we've discovered is that for a lot of the leaders that we've worked with, whether it be in support or in sales, bringing all of their data and giving them not just a view of what is happening with their customers, but the ability to reach in and try things and try and change things. Like onboarding takes 20 days. That's not great. We'd like it to be 10. Let's start experimenting and seeing how we could do that, has just been transformational for them. Like it's helped them better understand what their customers have been at, better understand what the motivations of their customers are, which is also incredibly important. And so, yeah, basically lowering those barriers and continuing to get more and more use cases in there, because it's been working. So the more people we can help, the better for us, the better for them.
Oh, I love that. Okay, I love that. We're no doubt going to be back, and you're going to have to come on, feature with us, talk to us about what you've been doing, what you've been building, where you are. So,
Sounds
fingers
good.
crossed.
That would be nice.
Good. Interviewing. So, if you want to set the scene for us, you were quite passionate about this when we were talking a couple of months back now about the interviewing landscape, and you've got some phenomenal experience setting up offices in some of these locations, which I'll let you speak about. But I think it's a really important topic that we get into and talk about today, just from start to finish, about what you think good looks like when it comes to interviewing really good people, attracting really good people at scale.
Yeah, it's a topic. I think why it's so passionate for me is that people kind of get into the mind space that interviewing is one piece of a process, but the reality is it colors everything that happens afterwards. Like the number of places I've been at where you can trace problems happening, what you would think is way, way, way down the line from somebody starting an onboarding back to the interview process, is huge. And so my first experience of this was when I joined a startup, Urban Airship at the time, they're now Airship. And I had never interviewed before. It wasn't something that I was familiar with doing, and I suddenly found myself in a lot of interviews, like hundreds of interviews, and getting very confused by the whole process and going, I don't feel like I'm very good at this, or I'm not entirely sure. I feel like I am following a script laid down by someone else, but I don't understand why I'm saying all of these words. And starting to think more about like, okay, why do we care about this? Why do we care about asking this question? What are we expecting to see out the other end of that? And then at Intercom, when the London office had just been created, almost all of the initial hiring had happened out of Dublin because we hadn't started yet, the folks who were going to set up the office. And so for the first kind of 6 to 12 months, that kind of carried on. But then we crossed this point where interviewing at Intercom is something that they take very, very seriously, which was brilliant. It was a fantastic kind of finishing school for, okay, let's talk about why. What are the important beats here? But what had kind of happened was there, especially when it came to engineering management interviewing, there was this very small core of people who could do the interviews. And outside of that, there was basically nobody had a clue what happened in those sessions. And that was mostly a case of just initially this wave of very senior people had gone through, they got promoted into management, they continued to progress. Then managers had started to get hired in from outside, like myself. I was one of the first wave of that. And so all of this knowledge got concentrated there. And we kind of got to a place as a company where it was incredibly difficult to run engineering management interviews, just not a place you want to be. And so myself and a couple of other people basically went, okay, how can we help fix this problem? And so it was how do we start breaking this process back down to its constituent pieces, figure out what we're looking for, and then use that to start training up other people. Because what was top of mind for me was my past experience of interview, where I sat in, watched other people interview, went, these are the questions I ask, and that's it. And I'm like, I don't know why I'm asking those questions. I'm just going to ask them, and we'll see what happens. It's like, no, that's not a great place to be. And then subsequently at Shopify, when it came to building out the organization in Europe, Well, one of, there's many organizations in Shopify in Europe, but they had this very interesting system where central hiring was kind of a round robin system. So you might get a newly hired person today and not see anybody else for 3 months. But if you sourced the candidates, you would get first pick of them when they came through. So yeah, it was a fascinating process because my job very, very quickly, because this was in the heady days of 21 and 22 when everybody was hiring everybody, I suddenly became a sourcer. And I was like sourcing 100 plus people a week, setting up initial phone screens with maybe 10, 15 people a week and getting them through into the process. So I was suddenly at a stage that was just way, way back from where I had been previously. Usually I talk to people after they've been in that pipeline for like weeks to a month, and suddenly I'm at the very first person they talk to all the way through. But it was another interesting perspective because at that stage, what you're talking to people is prepping them for what the process is. And you need to be careful about, you don't want to give them the cheat codes. You don't want to tell them like, well, here are the questions you're going to be asked. Please spend the next 3 weeks prepping for them. But you also want to give them an idea of, well, the interview is called X. Here's what's happening in there. Here's what's being looked for. Here's why those things are important. So yeah, it's been a journey from kind of slightly cargo culting and then quickly figuring out what I should be doing at Intercom, building a process back up from scratch, and then at Shopify, just heading way out to the beginning of the process and working from there forward.
Beginning of the process and going through that attraction process and speaking to people, it's very different, isn't it, to being further up, because further up the chain, let's say, and just in a round robin pool of people, let's say, because you struggle to empathize because of a lack of knowledge or understanding what happens at the start of the process, especially in that market where it was really tough. So it's nice that you've got that experience. You probably really appreciate that experience and
a
good candidate experience even more.
Absolutely, because I think this is anecdotal, but I suppose the sample size is relatively large. There are relatively few people I've interviewed or attempted to get to interview who have just been bad at their jobs. Like a tiny percentage, like I think less than 5%, I would say, picking a slightly arbitrary percentage out of thin air. What's far more likely is you've got someone who's very good at what they do, but that's not what you do. So Shopify, for instance, has a phenomenally strong engineering culture, like from Toby all the way down. Toby's the CEO, and at the customer events, he will code live on stage and show customers setting up like a store theme and getting it up and running. He is in the technical details, phenomenally engaged CEO on the tech side, and that goes all the way through the organization. It is an engineering organization that operates at slightly scary scale at times, and so it heavily biases towards engineers who are very much about the craft. They're very much about, I don't just want to get a solution in there and running. I need to know it's going to scale up to 2 million plus merchants. And that's not every good engineer fits that mold. Some engineers are very much in the space of, I'm going to give you a workable demo in the next 3 hours. And like at the stage of world that we're at right now, it's like, okay, there's a balance to be had there, but definitely I don't want you to sit there and figure out how to scale to 3 million customers when we're still getting into 10 customers. Like you're preempting things there. And Intercom, again, very, very strong engineering culture. But their culture leans heavily towards engineers who deeply understand product and why product is being built and are engaged with that process. And so there were a lot of people who, I'd be frequently asked, like at one company or the other, oh, do you know anybody we could borrow? And it's a case of, no, like very different cultures. I'm sure there are engineers who would be very successful in both, but I wouldn't take a staff engineer from Shopify, drop them in Intercom or vice versa, and expect them to be successful. And that initial stage is so important at figuring out and making it very clear to candidates, here's what an engineer here looks like. And you might not fit that mold. Doesn't mean you're bad. Doesn't mean you're a bad engineer any way, shape, or form. But this is what we're looking for. And if that doesn't fit you, if that doesn't sound appealing to you, probably best you don't force yourself to go through the process, because you're going to get told a lot that you're not fitting a preconceived notion, which frankly, like it's a challenging thing to sit there and have someone tell you that what you hear is you're not good enough. What's actually being said is you're not the right fit for this particular role. And it's like, if you can stop a candidate from hitting that brick wall face first, it's better. It's just better for everybody.
I think you've hit the nail on the head around working from a blank canvas and establishing, hopefully, in a calibration session, what are our most important problems, attributes in a person, characteristics, reverse engineering that process. I actually did this exercise with an engineering leader who's in London, came into the office, and we ran through this process ourselves. So I've been through that. And I think some companies don't do that enough, starting
Yeah.
from that canvas.
Absolutely. I actually, one of my personal bugbears with hiring is when you've just got a generic central hiring pipeline. I, do, I, do, I don't believe it guarantees candidate failure in any way, shape, or form, but it's that moment of figuring out, look, this team works in this way. They need someone who, like, the engineering culture of the organization is this gigantic circle. They occupy this space within that circle. And I think the closer you get to having a candidate who's there, the easier time everyone's going to have afterwards. Because it, like, as a lead, as a manager who's receiving incoming candidates, it always just killed me when I had someone who I knew was an incredibly smart engineer, was very good at what they did, but what they did wasn't what we did. And so they're now, for example, like, one of the areas at Shopify was payments, whereas you can imagine you need people who are incredibly detail orientated, like you're handling tens of billions of dollars of transactions a year. And you would get engineers who would come in and it's like, oh, you would be phenomenal over there. And part of it is I just don't like seeing people set up for failure. But yeah, I think you're right. Like, having that idea of, we're hiring for a role, this person needs to look roughly like, with obviously very fuzzy edges, look roughly like this, and then tailor the process, make it very clear to the candidates up front, and then tailor the process to looking towards that.
Can we break those two things down? So can you touch on how you would adopt the discovery of need process, and then how you would tailor that interview process off the back of that?
Sure. So my assumption in all of these things is that you already have a process in place. So it's not so much about building it net new, it's about taking an existing process and tailoring it towards. And ditto for the engineering culture that you're looking for. Like, I get very suspicious of people who are kind of like, oh, we only let people from the team interview candidates because we have our own culture. It's like, you're part of a bigger organization. You don't be an island unless you're doing something very specialized like security or something like that, in which case you folks know what you're at. But even then, anyway. So I think what it comes down to is, you can overfit, you can underfit. If you overfit, you're looking for a carbon copy of someone who's already on the team, which is a whole lot of problems in and of itself. You end up with, best case scenario, you end up with groupthink. Worst case scenario, you just end up with a team that is incredibly brittle. Like, they deal with pressure one way great, and in another way, everything falls down horribly. And then underfitting, you're just basically like, somebody who would be a good staff engineer probably would work here. It's like, somewhere between those 2 points is what you're looking for. I think the more senior the person or the role you're looking for, the more you need to have that nailed down. So that's where the literal job description comes from. And I think a lot of, well, not a lot. It's definitely gotten better. Again, showing my age. Like, way back when, the idea of what is a staff engineer is just kind of like, I don't know, someone who codes better. That's it, or knows more than everybody else. Whereas now, the concept of what leadership role do they perform on a team? What does that gap look like? Are we bringing on a staff engineer who's kind of the lead engineer archetype? So they're going to be doing a lot of not administrative roles, but more about the organization and the structure. Or are you going to bring somebody in who's a staff engineer because they're a domain specialist in this particular technology? And they're going, okay, cool. So here's what the job is going to look like. And then the raw material you've got is, you already have, I'm guessing every company I've ever talked to anybody at has always had something like this, where you've got the N interviews, somewhere usually between 2 and some terrifyingly large number. I've heard double digits. And it's like, okay, which parts of that job description match to which of those interviews? So for example, usually there'll be some sort of technical design on the tech side. So it's like, if you're hiring for that domain specialist, it's like, okay, well, we want someone running that interview who is very familiar with the technology themselves. We want the interview then to be not just generic questions about like stuff, but specifically in that area. So if it's mobile development, it's like, okay, we're going to focus on how would you deal with these challenges in native development. If it's somebody who's like a lead dev kind of archetype and they're going to be more in that force multiplier role, well, now suddenly it's more important how they've handled past projects, how they've handled challenges with other people or other parts of the organization. And there's probably some form of like soft skill interview that will get pivoted more heavily towards that. And like how they would mentor other engineers. So I think it's that process of you come up with the list, you look at the raw material that you've got in the interview loops, and then you basically the bit that always surprises me sometimes is when people go through all that but never tell the interviewers that it's like, oh no, we're really interested in how they've handled past projects and challenges in that area. You get to the debrief and it's like, so how did they deal with that? And the interviewer's like, what? Sorry, what? I was like, oh no, you didn't talk to them about that because you don't get another bite of the apple. You can't. Well, I mean, you could if you were. You could bring a candidate back and just rerun an interview, but it's a little bit of an odyssey. And usually, people have multiple offers on the table if they are good.
Definitely. You've spoken about a couple of really good points there. Can I ask a question? What's your opinion on using a problem, let's say an engineering problem inside of the business, and presenting that in an interview capacity or like a mock makeup interview question that probably emulates some similar challenges that you're finding? What's your take on either one of the two?
So this is an interesting one because I think if it's done well, it's phenomenally useful. And if it's done badly, it's a terrible experience for everybody involved. And I would have answered very differently up until I was at Intercom. And I would have said, this is a terrible idea, don't do it. Except Intercom, as part of their engineering loop, had, and I assume still have, what they call Minicom, which is basically build a miniature version of Intercom in the interview loop. And it's a multi-hour process. You go through multiple pairing sessions with engineers, Intercom engineers, who are there to pair with the candidate. They're not there to tell the candidate what to do or ask like gotcha questions. They're literally sitting there and going, cool, let's build this feature. Let's build an admin interface for these things and working through it with them. And it was something that there was a small group of engineers who spent a phenomenal amount of time making sure that it worked in multiple languages. You could do this in Ruby and Python and Java. The setup experience was incredibly simple and easy to get working. And they spent a long time training people to be that pair. Because you obviously don't just take a random engineer and go, pair with a candidate. It's like, yeah, that your results may vary there. And it was more about like, what does successful pairing in that environment look like? How do you ensure you're not the one writing the code and just using them as an interface with the keyboard? How do you challenge them enough that you're getting clear signal on the things that you're looking for in those processes? And the company invested a phenomenal amount of time in that, but it was one of the, like, it was never this simple, but if a candidate excelled at Minicom, it was usually a pretty good sign that the other interview stages were going to go well. It was a pretty, it wasn't the only, obviously it wasn't the only signal, otherwise there wouldn't have been other interviews run, but it was that piece of how quickly did they get engaged with the product, how enthusiastic were they, how happy were they to pair with somebody else, and how would they talk through the problems. And it was far more like being an actual engineer than sitting there and talking to somebody about projects you've previously been on. Like, what was the last project that didn't go well and what did you learn from the experience? It's not something that an engineer does day to day versus sitting there and actually working on a proper code base in a language they're familiar with, building features.
Yeah. So it feels as if you're able to really invest in that as part of your process and think about the edge cases, think about the experience, think about everything that probably could go wrong with using part of your product, think about everything and make sure you're investing time in the right people to be able to succeed, it can go really well. But other than that, it might not go well.
Yeah, I think it's, I would probably make the same statement about the interview process as a whole. Like I've interviewed at places and I've talked to people who have worked at places where the interview process has been coin flip-esque in that if the interviewer isn't clear in their head what they're looking for, and they're not clear how the questions they're asking will ladder up to that, unfortunately, and this is so dangerous, what you're essentially doing is having a popularity contest. How nice was it to talk to somebody? And I'm Irish, and we have some stereotypes about being able to talk and being friendly with people that are a lot of the time true. And I found that places where their processes were far more lackadaisical than they should be, that was getting me through when it really shouldn't have. And I that's again, it's one of those times when you're essentially hiring for people who you get on with. And there are probably worse ways of doing hiring. Well, maybe there aren't, but it does produce organizations where it's like everybody is a carbon copy. Everybody is basically who gets on with person X because they were the first engineer to be hired, and everybody else was only hired if person X liked them. And you suddenly end up with engineering leaders going, why, whenever we have a product production incident, does everything go on fire and everyone gets stressed for the next 3 weeks? And it's like, well, because you hired a bunch of people who are all the same and they all get stressed in stressful situations.
Yeah, exactly. I think you've hit the nail on the head. I see it time and time again. I do see it from businesses where they only want to hire certain types of people from organizations or backgrounds, which I think has its merit, and people have obviously had successes with their own signals towards that merit, but also there's a balance to be had, that there are incredibly smart people that have worked in other organizations, studied elsewhere, whatever it might be, that really could fit into your team. That's the really tough one to try and, like, I think, crack.
It works like it's one of those things where in interviewing you just have to work against human nature so actively, because if you just walk into an interview and you don't have you walk into it like you're just having a chat with someone, again, the person who is you see yourself less reflected in for whatever set of reasons, you're going to have less of a good time with than somebody who shares all of your interests, has the same lived life experiences, has worked at the same kind of companies. Like if you both worked at company X and you spend the first 30 minutes of the conversation joking about how crazy it was to work there, you'll obviously leave that interview with like, oh yeah, that was a good chat. That was really good. But it's why I think training and clearly laying out what each of those sessions are trying to do is so important. Because in the absence of any sort of guidance, people will create their own rubric for what it looks like. And so one of the things that we did at Intercom, which I think was quite successful, I'm heavily biased here, was for each of the sessions, go back to what does the performance review for a person in this role look like? And then go, right, so what questions from that does this interview have to answer? And then very clearly lay out at the bottom, as an interviewer, you have not done your job unless you can clearly state that they're able to deal with this, that they're capable of working through this, that they have experience of this. And again, it wasn't that, like, obviously the people who were doing these interviews are very, very senior, but it meant that everybody was singing from the same hymn sheet. If you had 5 candidates with 5 different interviewers, all 5 of those people should be able to answer the same questions. Otherwise, again, you run this risk of, like, one person had a phenomenally positive experience because they just talked about random stuff for 45 minutes, whereas the other 4 candidates got grilled on their past experiences of dealing with, like, firing people or underperforming teams. And I think making it just that black and white. Here, our expectation of you as an interviewer is that when you leave the room, you can answer these questions. Full stop. And other context and other color, absolutely welcome, but do not leave until you can answer these questions.
Yeah. Okay. That's solid. Can you talk to us more about the decision-making process? So you've touched on it there, as in you almost want like these set of non-negotiables that you have to walk away from. That seemingly sounds like a management role, but talk to us about, it's quite broad, but the decision-making process generally. Could be scorecards, could be any other technique, or what's unique about that.
Here's where I go, and it sounds like I'm going to contradict myself, but I'll explain why. I'm not a massive fan of scorecards.
Okay.
Like when I'm running a debrief and when I've got a number of people, interviewers, in front of me. There's a piece here where, and obviously it depends on the company, but you expect that they've all gone through a degree of training on how to interview well. They've gone through training on things like unconscious biases and how to eliminate those from the process. And that they're all relatively senior. Like generally, you don't take people who are 6 months out of college and put them in interviewing staff engineers. So you've got very senior, very experienced people and who have an idea of how the process works and why it works the way it works. They've had a clear brief going into those interviews. And so, in theory, usually, they're all going to come out with at least the ability to talk on these points about the candidate. And so, it obviously is something that you have to be careful of because bias can enter into this whole process so easily. But it's about talking about the experiences and going, okay, so if you were interviewing an engineering management candidate and you were talking to them about their people management experience, how did the conversation about managing underperformance go? Like what stood out to you from that conversation? Because once you've done more than a handful of these, you start to there's patterns that you see forming. Like humans generally, when for say something like under management, you're looking for the people who just softballed it the entire time or never talked to the person who was underperforming until they fired them, and you're like, oh no, that's troubling. Or did the person deal with upfront? Did they make a clear plan for the person? Did they make it very obvious and transparent why they believed there was underperformance, and how did they work through that with the person who they believed was underperforming? And so you trust that the people who are in the room have that kind of experience to be able to speak to those things. And then it's a case of going back to what that original job description was, and are you ticking, how many of the boxes are you ticking? And it's never binary. It's like, it could be 50% of this, 75% of this. They absolutely, this is their superpower. They're brilliant at that. And then the real fun in games is when you are then comparing multiple candidates against each other. And I think as an industry, I think on the this is potentially heavily biased. On the engineering side of things, I think it's much clearer what that comparison would look like. You are archetypes are far more well established, especially when it comes to senior roles on the engineering side. It's like, well, this person would be a fantastic lead engineer, but we're looking for the subject matter expert. So keep them in mind, but probably not for this role. Whereas on the management side, it can get a little bit fuzzier, where it's like, well, this person's really good at technical details and project management, but this person's better at managing teams, and this person is better at organizational issues. And that's probably where, unfortunately, organizations have the fuzziest definition of what they're looking for. And so there's just far more pressure on the person running, the hiring manager running the process, to figure out who am I looking for and why am I looking for that person. And I mean, it's a place where self-doubt can enter in a lot. And you start second guessing yourself and thinking, wait, hold on. Should I hold out for more people? Should I go with this person?
Definitely.
And obviously in management, there's a larger blast radius if you get that answer wrong.
True. Very true. I think lastly, we've touched on it through this, and you made a note towards it when actually going through the sourcing part of the role, the experience. I talk about the experience as being able to be organization's X factor at times, even more so than money. And I think someone used that phrase on LinkedIn, X factor. So I'm stealing it a little bit, but I so agree, as in it can be really powerful when an organization moves with speed. They have really clear expectations, communication, feedback loops. That's an incredible place to be.
Absolutely. Like, this waxes and wanes, but usually there's either the power either resides in the hiring or the hiree, and that obviously is a cycle and depends on seniority and everything else. But no matter where it sits, I always feel like candidate experience is part of your public branding as a company. And the companies where you do your last interview, you don't hear from them in 2 weeks. You message the recruiter and go, "Hi, what's up?" And a week later, you get a response going, "We went with somebody else," and you're like, "Cool, okay, right, that was terrible." And I think there's also an element here of, I joked slightly about it earlier about double-digit number of interviews, but that also fits into it too. Like, if you've got if you're taking up a candidate's time in an interview, have a clear idea of why you're doing it. Like, what signal are you getting from that 30, 45, 60-minute chunk that you're not getting from anywhere else? And if you don't have a good answer, please stop. You're wasting your time. You're wasting the candidate's time. So I kind of view it as a holistic thing. Like, you want candidates to feel like they are not just a number, they are a person going through the process, that they have clear expectations being set of what they're expected to do, what a particular interview is going to be looking for, any prep they need to do for it, and that at no point are they left sitting there going, what's happening? What am I meant to be doing something there? I mean, it's very similar to building a good product. Lack of feedback is really bad. Like, if you have a product where you click a button and nothing happens in the UI, and 3 hours later something changes, nobody would consider that acceptable.
I think even for the interviewer, it's pretty painful explaining what's going to be in this interview and watching someone, the cogs turning in their brain, going, right, how am I solving this? And there's silence, or someone's flustered, nervous, whatever it might be. But that is a wasted exercise in itself. Give someone the tools, provide them with a platform to work from, see how well they do. It's going to be a better conversation than them not knowing, regardless.
Absolutely. Because I think something that's missed a lot of the time, and the best interviewers I've ever known have always focused on this a lot, is you want to get the best out of the person you're talking to. You want to get signal. No signal is bad. No signal means either the candidate was so nervous they clammed up, which has happened to me before and is not a fun experience for anybody involved, or you've just asked bad questions, or you've gone around in circles, or you've allowed a candidate to give a 30-minute answer to a question that should have been a 5-minute answer, and you've run out of time to do everything else. And part of your job as the interviewer is to make sure that you get that signal and make sure that you're able to answer those questions later on. And yeah, the best way of doing that for the organization is that the candidate going into the interview knows what's being expected of them. I think both Intercom actually and Shopify had an entire website dedicated to this, where as soon as you were in the process, they were like, here are all the interviews that you're going to go through. Here's the prep we will need you to do. Like, make sure. So one of them was like, talk through past projects that you've worked on. So they like very up front say, make sure they're top of mind. Like, maybe write some details down, so if you get flustered, you're not just going to go completely blank on it. And you're right. Like, having that happen beforehand just gives everybody the best possible chance of doing their jobs well. The candidate for showing everything they're capable of doing, and the interviewer for getting the strongest signal possible.
And you still hire incredible people. It's funny that, isn't it?
Yeah. Again, I think it's a lot of interviewing. People kind of work it in this very red team way, where it's like, prevent bad people from getting into the organization. And I think really it's more, yeah, sure, okay, there are people out there who have titles in this space who are just not very good at their jobs. They do exist. But far, far, far more likely is this person is a fantastic engineer over there, not here. And it's less about gotchas and less about like grilling them about things, and more about figuring out, are you the type of person who will be successful here? Will you help us grow as an organization? Will you push our boundaries constructively and help us do things we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise? And rather than like, okay, we're going to grill you on the semantics of Python lists for 20 minutes. And it's like, okay, I don't know what this is telling you, but I don't think it's useful.
Yeah. No, 100%. Listen, you've given us some excellent nuggets. It's been great to listen about your Intercom journey, Shopify journey, now on your Pavlov journey with your other co-founders. So up the win for you guys. I will be checking in the next 12 months, seeing where you guys and girls are up to. But thanks for coming and share your wisdom on interviewing. And I think we've covered quite a lot of bases, good bases, that hopefully there's enough takeaways for people that they can pull one or two things out and start implementing into their processes from both of us.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an area where learning just makes everybody in the industry better. Bad hiring practices just they suck for everybody.
Absolutely spot on. So I want to say a massive thanks. Thanks from me, everyone here at Engineers, for people listening, likes, shares, subscribership, and all that fun stuff. keeps this little ecosystem buzzing, booming, and we get to speak to people like Niall. And Niall, best of luck with business. And thanks so much for coming to join us.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Pleasure. Thanks a lot, and bye for now.
Bye.
Hey guys, thanks for watching this episode. Massively appreciate you listening and checking in with us. If you want to find out more about us and what we're doing, please check us out on social media. What we're trying to do at Enginears is build a community to drive knowledge sharing and experiences. On Twitter, we can be found Enginears.io. It's no_. We've also got a website, which is enginears.io. These links will all be posted in the description. Any feedback and comments are massively appreciated. We're always looking to improve on where we can. Thanks, guys.